Hello, my name is Professor Louise Ryan, and I'm a Professor of Sociology at London Metropolitan University. And today I want to talk about an article I've recently published with some colleagues on the theme of migration, particularly focusing on older migrants and their experiences in particular places where they live, but also against the backdrop of bigger political changes associated with Brexit, but also the recent Windrush scandal. You can see the names of my colleagues there on the screen. This is the name of the article, Analysing Migrants Ageing in Place as Embodied Practices of Embedding Through Time, and it's got the catchy subtitle, Kilburn is not Kilburn anymore. The article is fully open access and it can be downloaded and read at your leisure. I'm just going to close my picture. Now, in terms of the A-level syllabus, the presentation today, and indeed the wider article, relates to specific themes in the syllabus: culture and identity, particularly ethnicity and age, families and households, especially migration and aging populations, but also research methods, as this is a good example, I think, of a qualitative study using in-depth, rich interviews and also addressing some ethical issues on interviewing older people. Now, as you know, in the context of an aging society, there's increasing attention on how people make sense of the particular places where they live and how they experience those as they get older. Aging, coupled with, of course, bereavement, the loss of a partner, the loss of friends, can really lead to diminishing networks as you get older, and this may impact on your sense of belonging, feeling part of a local community. But of course, the place where you live is also changing. If you think about the place where you live and think about how much it's changed over the years, imagine for an older person how much change they've seen in those locations, in those towns, villages, or cities over the years. Now, migrants are often depicted as young people, and of course, many migrants are young, but they also age, and of course, as they age, they have lots of changing needs, experiences, and relationships. And there's been calls for more research on the diversity of aging migrants. Migrants are not all the same, and migrants may have different experiences depending on their ethnicity, their nationality, etc. Although many of migrants arrive in Britain as young people, as they get older, especially as they retire, they may think about returning to their home country. But of course, many of them have children and grandchildren in Britain. Indeed, many of you may be the grandchildren of migrants who came to Britain. And indeed, returning to their home country may also not be easy because that country too has changed. Now, the study that we conducted was funded by the Economic and Social Research Council. It was part of a larger programme at the University of Sheffield entitled Sustainable Care. We had 3 different migrant groups, people born in Poland, Ireland, and the Caribbean. And we had 2 different research sites, London as a large city and South Yorkshire as a more rural area made up of small towns and villages. The research was conducted between the summer of 2018 and 2019, luckily before the pandemic. We interviewed 47 people, so it was a relatively small qualitative study. And the key feature about our participants is that they were quite old. The average age was 81, and some of them were in their 90s. And we were particularly interested in their dynamic relationships to place through the intersection of age, gender, ethnicity, and class. Now, most of our participants had arrived in Britain in the 1940s and 50s, and they played a key role in rebuilding Britain after the war. In fact, many of them spoke about the sacrifices and the contribution they'd made through their hard work. Many of the women from Ireland and the Caribbean had been nurses in the NHS. Many of the men had worked in construction. Many of the Polish men, in fact, had worked as miners. But they remembered a lot of hostility, racism, and discrimination that they encountered. Particularly participants from the Caribbean and Ireland talked about those infamous signs, no blacks, no Irish. Now, for you today as young people in the 21st century, it may be hard to imagine a time when you could walk around the streets of London and see signs in a window, no Irish, no blacks. But this was not unusual in the 50s and 60s. So Henry, for example, from Jamaica, recalled remembering signs, no Irish, no dogs, no blacks. Similarly, Ronan recalled you'd see a sign, vacancies, but underneath it would say no blacks, no dogs, no Irish. That was terrible, shocking, hurtful. And Joseph, who was from Poland and came as a refugee after the Second World War, recalled being quite openly called bloody foreigners. And many of our participants talked about how it was quite normal in those days for people to come up to you and say, go home, bloody foreigner. So for those of us today, that might be quite hard to imagine, but our participants remembered it very clearly. However, over the years, they did manage to create a sense of being at home, a sense of belonging in their local areas. So, for example, Gabriel, who came originally from Jamaica, had lived in Sheffield in Yorkshire for over 60 years. He came when he was just 23, and he said he kind of grew up in Sheffield. Similarly, Miriam, who came from Ireland originally, who was 79 years of age, she'd lived in the same street in Cricklewood for decades, and Cricklewood had started to feel like her home. So people who arrived in the 1950s and 60s, encountering hostility, over the decades, they'd managed to build a sense of home and belonging. However, that does not mean that everything was fine and just taken for granted. As we said at the beginning, the places where people live are dynamic and constantly changing. And of course, as you get older, your needs and your mobility may also change. And so what can happen is that familiar places can begin to feel unfamiliar. And a very good example of this was the experience of Kathleen, who was a 90-year-old Irish woman, a widow. She lived in a tower block. And in fact, myself and my colleague, we went to interview her in the tower block, and she spoke about how difficult it was when the lift was out of order to get up and down the stairs in her tower block. And she talked about how Kilburn had changed. A lot of her friends had died. She was now 90 years old. She felt very alone. And Kilburn had changed so much, it didn't feel like Kilburn anymore. And that's where we got the title for the article. It was a very powerful interview, a very powerful quotation. But it wasn't just personal experiences as people got older that meant that they had issues about feeling a sense of belonging. Wider political issues were also crucial to our participants. And when we were doing the interviews, there were two big political issues that attracted attention: Brexit and the Windrush scandal. We'll talk about Brexit first. Many of our Polish participants were very concerned about Brexit. They were concerned that they may no longer be accepted, that they may no longer be wanted in Britain. But they were also concerned about access to care, access to migrant workers being able to come in, particularly in the care sector. And this was mentioned by Evelina and also by Agnieszka. And of course, we now know that the government is having problems recruiting staff into the care sector, particularly to work in care homes. So these concerns about how Brexit might impact on access to care have proven to be valid. Brexit, of course, also provoked a lot of debate about migration and a lot of public hostility against migrants. And this was experienced by Artur, who at 65 was one of our youngest participants. He was originally from Poland. He lived on a council estate in South Yorkshire, and he described having eggs thrown at his house in what he very much perceived as a targeted attack due to anti-Polish migrant sentiment associated with Brexit. The other thing that Brexit did was raise concerns about the Northern Ireland peace process. And we know, because it's being reported in the news recently, that indeed Brexit has provoked issues and problems and tensions on the Northern Ireland border. And this was something that our Irish participants talked about, in particular Maeve and Matthew. They were really worried that Brexit was going to destabilise the peace process in Northern Ireland. And they were really worried about this, how this was going to affect Irish migrants in particular. And they remembered back to the days of previous bombing campaigns in Britain when Irish people were targeted as a suspect community. The other big issue of the time when we were doing the interviews was the Windrush scandal. And for those of you who may not be familiar with the Windrush scandal, this was a government policy which targeted particularly migrants from the Caribbean who had come in many decades earlier, but had not achieved British citizenship who didn't have a British passport and who were now deemed to not have the correct immigration paperwork, and so were being deported back to the Caribbean. And this was something that very much concerned and upset our Caribbean participants. And they talked about how they had come in the 50s and 60s as British subjects, but then how the rules, the immigration rules, had changed from the 60s through to the 80s. They luckily had found out about these changes, often through churches and informal community groups, and so they were able to get British passports, but they completely understood how other people from the Caribbean had not received that information, were not aware of the changes, and now found themselves without correct passports and in danger of being deported. Now, none of our participants were personally affected by the Windrush deportations, but nonetheless it affected them deeply. Iris, for example, said she was very angry about the deportations of Jamaicans from Britain. It hurts us, though it's not me. You see injustice, and it affects us. It's my brother or my sister. And this is a very interesting quote, because although Iris personally was not affected by the deportations, it still hurt her because she empathized with the men and women who were being deported from Britain, because they were like her brother or her sister. And similarly, Samantha, also from Jamaica, criticized the government's shifting immigration priorities. She said, they invited us to come here to clean up this place, and then once it's clean, they just toss people out. And this is true, of course. The government did invite migrants to come after the war to help rebuild Britain. And now people feel that they're no longer wanted, they're simply being tossed aside. So we can see that the uncertainty caused by Brexit and the Windrush scandal can really affect the extent to which migrants feel welcome and feel that they belong in this country. It can create a sense of uncertainty, unease, and even a sense of injustice. And this can also provoke encounters in local places where you encounter hostility and you feel like you're not welcome and you're not wanted. And this is particularly pertinent for older migrants, like our participants, who've lived in Britain for most of their lives, in some cases 60 years. So in our article, we've sought to answer calls for more research on the intersection of ageing and other markers of identity, particularly ethnicity, and how these embodied and emplaced experiences of ageing really impact on people from different ethnic backgrounds. We illustrate the ongoing efforts and negotiations of placemaking over time. So through the life course, our participants developed strategies. They drew on their networks to feel part of communities, but this could then be undermined by wider political events like Brexit and the Windrush scandal. And so finally, to conclude, I would like to thank the funders of the research project, the Economic and Social Research Council. This was part of a large sustainable care grant at the University of Sheffield. So I hope you found the presentation interesting, and I hope that you might go and read the full article in your own time.